My brother spent years sucking up to our wealthy uncle, but the will reading revealed who really deserved his estate. Growing up, my brother Caleb was the golden child who could do no wrong. I was the screw-up who got detention, failed algebra twice, and dropped out of community college. When our parents died in that car accident when I was 19, Caleb stepped up. He was already in law school, already had his life figured out. Uncle Garrett owned half the commercial real estate downtown and never married. No kids, just money, and a massive estate that everyone whispered about at family gatherings. Caleb saw his opportunity and pounced. For 15 years, I watched my brother transform into Uncle Garrett's personal assistant. Every holiday, every birthday, every minor medical appointment, Caleb was there with flowers, expensive wine, and that practiced smile he'd perfected in law school. He moved across town to be closer, started showing up at Uncle Garrett's country club, playing golf with men twice his age just to network for our uncle. He even dumped his college girlfriend because Uncle Garrett made some comment about her being too ethnic for family photos. Meanwhile, I was struggling, working 3 jobs to keep my apartment, dealing with my anxiety disorder that nobody understood, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Uncle Garrett barely acknowledged my existence at family functions. When he did speak to me, it was usually to ask why I couldn't be more like Caleb. The whole family treated me like the charity case. Caleb would slip me money sometimes, but always with this condescending tone like he was doing me this huge favor. Like I should be grateful he even bothered. Last year, Uncle Garrett got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months. Caleb immediately took family leave from his law firm to become Uncle Garrett's full-time caregiver. He hired the best nurses, researched experimental treatments, flew him to specialists in different states. I visited when I could, but my work schedule was insane, and honestly, the whole family made me feel like an outsider anyway. Plus, watching Caleb perform this elaborate caretaker routine was nauseating. He'd fluff pillows and fetch water like he was auditioning for sainthood. When Uncle Garrett passed away 3 months ago, Caleb was devastated. Real tears, genuine grief. Whatever else you could say about my brother, he genuinely grown to love the old man. The will reading was scheduled for today. Caleb had been confident for weeks, already talking about selling the house, liquidating assets, maybe starting his own practice with his inheritance. He'd earned it, right? 15 years of devotion. We sat in the lawyer's office, Caleb in his best suit, me in jeans and a button-down I'd borrowed. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. To my nephew Caleb, who has shown such dedication these past years, I leave my golf clubs and my collection of vintage wines. Caleb's face went white. That was it? After everything? The lawyer continued. To my nephew who never asked me for anything, who visited not for what he could get but because he saw me as a person, who treated me like family instead of a bank account, I leave the remainder of my estate. The silence in that law office was deafening. Caleb's mouth hung open like he was trying to catch flies. I felt dizzy, like the room was spinning around me. The lawyer kept reading numbers. The house worth $2.8 million. Investment portfolios totaling $4.6 million. The commercial properties generating $300K annually in rental income. All of it was mine. Caleb finally found his voice. There has to be some mistake. He barely even visited. I was there every day for the past year. Every single day. The lawyer pulled out a sealed envelope. Mr. Garrett left additional instructions to be read if anyone contested the will. He opened it and read aloud. To Caleb, I hope someday you understand the difference between love and performance. You gave me 15 years of what you thought I wanted to see. Your brother gave me something much rarer, authenticity. When he visited, he never once asked about my money or my plans. He'd tell me about his jobs, his struggles, his small victories. He treated me like a person, not a project. I remember the night he drove me to the emergency room when you were out of town at that legal conference. He stayed until 4 a.m., not because he had to, but because he was genuinely worried. He held my hand during the CT scan when I was scared. That meant more to me than 1,000 catered meals or weekly house cleanings. Your brother never performed for me. When he was tired, he looked tired. When he disagreed with my opinions, he respectfully said so. When he couldn't visit, he didn't make elaborate excuses. He just said he couldn't make it. That honesty was refreshing after watching you choreograph every interaction for my approval. I also remember when he brought me that terrible gas station coffee during one of my chemo sessions because the hospital coffee was worse. He didn't research the best artisanal coffee shop in town or bring an expensive espresso machine. He just noticed I looked tired and thought caffeine might help. It was such a small thing, but it came from genuine care, not calculated generosity. When he lost his job at the warehouse last year, he didn't ask me for money. He picked up extra shifts at the restaurant and started driving for a delivery app. He never once acted like I owed him anything because we shared DNA. That kind of independence and pride is rare these days. Your brother sees people's humanity first, their usefulness second. You've spent 15 years seeing my bank account first, me second. I don't fault you for it entirely. Our family taught you that love is transactional, that care must be earned and maintained through elaborate displays of devotion. But your brother somehow escaped that programming. The lawyer folded the letter. The reading was over. Caleb sat frozen, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been heartbreak. I stumbled out to my beat-up Honda in the parking lot, hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. 15 minutes ago, I was worried about making rent. Now I was worth almost $8 million. My phone started buzzing immediately. Word travels fast in families, especially when money's involved. Aunt Patricia called first. Honey, you know Caleb's been struggling with his practice. Maybe you could share the inheritance? It's what your uncle would have wanted. That was rich, considering she'd never given me the time of day before today. The same woman who'd told everyone at Mom's funeral that I'd never amount to anything without proper guidance. The same woman who'd forgotten my birthday for 6 years running, but somehow remembered it now. Cousin Mitchell was next. Bro, this is incredible. We should celebrate. You buying? He laughed like we were old friends, even though he'd spent our entire childhood telling everyone I was the family disappointment. The same Mitchell who'd borrowed $500 from me 3 years ago for car repairs and never mentioned paying it back. The same Mitchell who'd crossed the street to avoid talking to me when he saw me working at the grocery store. The calls kept coming. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had my number and urgent reasons to reconnect. Amazing how generosity blooms in people when they think you can afford to water it. Cousin Diane wanted to discuss investment opportunities. She'd always been the practical one, the family accountant who balanced everyone's checkbooks and gave unsolicited financial advice. Now she was talking about some boutique she wanted to open with my backing, speaking in numbers and percentages like she was presenting a business plan. Great Aunt Helen called to tell me about her church's building fund. They needed a new roof and new heating system, and wouldn't it be wonderful if someone in the family could help the congregation in their time of need? She spoke as if I'd been chosen by divine providence specifically to repair her house of worship. Even my estranged half-sister Meredith, who'd refused to come to our parents' funeral, suddenly remembered she had a brother. She'd been radio silent for 8 years, but now she was calling about her daughter's college fund and how expensive tuition had become. Her daughter, who I'd never met, for a college I'd never heard her mention before. My old boss from the hardware store called. He'd heard about my good fortune and wondered if I might be interested in investing in the business. We could expand, open new locations, maybe even franchise. He spoke like we'd been close friends instead of employer and employee in a relationship that had ended when he laid me off during a slow season without severance pay. I drove to the cemetery where Uncle Garrett was buried. The headstone was simple, just his name and dates. Caleb had wanted something elaborate with inspirational quotes and cherub sculptures and maybe a small mausoleum, but Uncle Garrett had specifically requested simplicity in his final arrangements. I sat on the grass next to his grave, feeling overwhelmed and guilty and confused all at once. Uncle Garrett, I said to the headstone, I don't know what to do with this. I don't even know how to be rich. The wind rustled through the oak trees he'd loved. He'd specifically requested to be buried under one, saying he'd spent enough time inside buildings during his life and wanted to be outside afterward. In my pocket, my phone kept buzzing with congratulations that felt more like invoices. I thought about the last real conversation we'd had, maybe 2 months before he died. I'd stopped by after my shift at the restaurant, still smelling like fryer oil and exhaustion. Uncle Garrett was having a bad day. The chemo made him nauseous and weak, and he'd spent most of it in bed. Tell me about work, he'd said when I found him in his study, wrapped in the quilt Mom had made him years earlier. Most people asked that question as a polite formality, the social equivalent of asking about the weather. But Uncle Garrett actually listened when I described the chaos of dinner rush, the regulars who left good tips and the difficult customers who didn't. He asked follow-up questions about my co-workers, remembered their names from previous visits, inquired about their personal dramas and small victories. There's this older guy who comes in every Thursday, I'd told him. Orders the same thing, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, and always sits in the corner booth. Tips exactly 15%, never more, never less. But he's polite to everyone, asks about our families, remembers details from week to week. What's his story? Uncle Garrett had asked. His wife died last year, I'd explained. Thursday was their date night for 30 years. The waitress who worked Thursdays before me said he's been coming in every week since she passed, ordering her favorite meal and sitting at their table. Uncle Garrett had been quiet for a long moment. That's loyalty, he'd said finally. That's love, that doesn't know how to quit. You're good with people, he'd observed later. You see them as individuals instead of types. I'd laughed. That's probably why I'm a terrible waiter. I spend too much time talking to lonely customers instead of turning tables. That's not terrible, he'd said. That's rare. Most people rush through interactions, checking boxes, performing their roles. You actually connect. Now, sitting by his grave, I understood what he'd meant. Caleb saw Uncle Garrett as the wealthy uncle who could change his life, the key to financial security and social advancement. I'd seen him as the guy who got excited about terrible reality TV shows, who always asked about my mother's garden that I'd inherited and consistently killed plants in, who kept track of my coworkers' personal lives and genuinely cared about their well-being. That evening, I went to my apartment. The same cramped one-bedroom I'd lived in for 5 years. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. The furniture looked shabbier, though it was the same second-hand collection I'd assembled piece by piece. The kitchen felt smaller, though the dimensions hadn't altered. I was still me, but now I was me with money, and somehow that made everything else seem temporary. I sat on my second-hand couch, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since I moved in. My landlord kept promising to fix it, the same way he kept promising to repair the loose floorboard in the bathroom and the window that wouldn't close properly. Now I could buy this entire building if I wanted, fix every problem myself, evict every tenant who annoyed me. The thought was terrifying. The apartment felt smaller with wealth, as if money took up physical space. I found myself calculating the cost of everything. This couch from the thrift store, $75. The coffee table I'd built from milk crates and a piece of wood, maybe $20 in materials. The entire contents of my home were worth less than Uncle Garrett probably spent on a single dinner at his country club. Caleb showed up around 8 p.m., looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled like he'd worn it to bed. "We need to talk," he said when I opened the door. He sat on my couch, head in his hands. The same couch he'd criticized 2 years earlier as being too small and uncomfortable for entertaining. Now he didn't seem to notice the lumpy cushions or the stain on the armrest where I'd spilled wine during a particularly lonely evening. "I don't understand," he said, his voice muffled. I gave him everything, 15 years of my life. I turned down job opportunities to take care of him. I delayed getting married, having kids. I put my entire life on hold. The job opportunities he'd turned down weren't sacrifices. They were calculated decisions. Caleb had received offers from firms in other cities, partnerships that would have required him to relocate away from Uncle Garrett. He'd rejected them not out of love, but out of investment strategy. Stay close to the money, maintain access to the inheritance. The marriage he'd delayed was with a woman named Vanessa, who'd grown tired of competing with his uncle for attention. She'd broken up with him after he canceled their weekend getaway to attend one of Uncle Garrett's doctor appointments that I could have handled just as easily. I sat across from him in the folding chair I'd bought at a garage sale, the same chair he'd refused to sit in during previous visits because it wasn't substantial enough to support his image. You gave him what you thought he wanted. But maybe what he actually wanted was just to feel like a regular person instead of a dying rich man that everyone was trying to impress. Caleb looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "So what? You're saying I wasted 15 years? "No," I said carefully. "I'm saying maybe you loved the idea of Uncle Garrett more than you loved Uncle Garrett himself." That hit him like a physical blow. He doubled over, making these awful choking sounds that might have been sobs or might have been something deeper than grief, the sound of someone's entire worldview crumbling. I moved to the couch and put my arm around him, the same way I'd done when we were children. When we were kids, before our parents died, before money became this thing that divided us, Caleb used to have nightmares. Not the ordinary childhood fears of monsters under the bed, but complex anxiety dreams about failing tests or disappointing adults. I'd climb into his bed and we'd tell each other stories until he fell back asleep. "Look," I said, "Uncle Garrett left me this money, but he left you something too. You spent 15 years learning how to care for someone else. That's not nothing. That's actually pretty valuable." Caleb wiped his nose on his sleeve, a gesture so unlike his usual composure that it reminded me of the brother I'd known before image became everything. "But the money, how are you not angry? How are you not gloating?" I would be. I thought about that question for a long moment. "Maybe that's the difference," I said finally. "I never expected anything from him, so I'm not disappointed, just overwhelmed. But you deserve it more than I do," he said, and I could hear the genuine confusion in his voice. "You actually cared about him as a person. Maybe we both cared. Just differently," I suggested. "You cared by trying to make his life easier. I cared by trying to make his life feel normal." We talked until 2 a.m. that night, longer than we'd talked in years. Caleb told me things I'd never known about Uncle Garrett's final months. How he talked about our parents, wondering if he'd failed them somehow by not being more involved in our lives after they died. How he'd felt guilty about his own success when his sister, our mother, had struggled financially as a single parent after Dad's death. "He loved us both," Caleb said, staring at his hands, "but differently. He saw something in you that he thought needed protecting. He saw something in me that he thought needed correcting." "What do you mean?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. "He used to tell me stories about you when you were younger, before I started coming around so much. He said you had this way of making people feel seen, that you'd talk to the grocery store cashier about her night classes, or remember the mailman's grandchildren's names, or help elderly neighbors carry their groceries without being asked. I'd forgotten Uncle Garrett had noticed those things. They'd seemed like basic human decency, not special virtues worthy of inheritance. He said I'd lost that somewhere along the way," Caleb continued, "that I'd become so focused on impressing people that I'd forgotten how to connect with them. He worried that my success was making me hollow. Over the next few days, I started learning what having money actually meant in practical terms. The lawyer referred me to a financial advisor, who referred me to an accountant, who referred me to an estate planning attorney. Everyone had opinions about what I should do with my windfall, and everyone seemed to have business cards and hourly rates. The financial advisor, a sharp woman named Ms. Rodriguez, laid out conservative investment strategies that would ensure I never had to work again. She spoke in percentages and projected returns, showing me charts that mapped out decades of financial security. Her office was decorated with awards and certificates that proclaimed her expertise in managing inherited wealth. "Bonds," she said, sliding a folder across her mahogany desk. "Conservative growth funds. Maybe some real estate investment trusts. You could live comfortably on the interest alone without ever touching the principal." The accountant, Mr. Peterson, explained tax implications that made my head spin. Estate taxes, capital gains, the difference between inherited assets and income, quarterly payment schedules, deductions I'd never imagined. He spoke rapidly, assuming I understood terms I'd never encountered, occasionally pausing to explain concepts with barely concealed impatience. The estate planner, a distinguished older man named Mr. Hartford, talked about trusts and charitable foundations and legacy planning. He showed me thick binders full of legal documents, structures designed to protect wealth across generations, mechanisms for controlling how money would be distributed long after my death. "You'll want to think about your legacy," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "How do you want to be remembered? What causes matter to you? Proper planning now can ensure your values are reflected in how this wealth is managed for decades to come." It was overwhelming and terrifying, and sometimes I'd wake up panicked at 3 a.m., convinced it was all a mistake that would be corrected by morning. I'd check my bank balance on my phone in the darkness, seeing numbers that didn't feel real, amounts that seemed too large to belong to someone like me. The strangest part was how quickly other people's behavior toward me changed. My landlord, who'd been unresponsive to maintenance requests for months, suddenly returned my calls within hours. The manager at the grocery store where I'd worked part-time the previous year greeted me by name when I went shopping, asking about my family and my plans as if we'd been close friends. Even casual acquaintances treated me differently. The barista at my usual coffee shop, who'd never spoken to me beyond taking my order, started asking about my day and recommending new drinks. The postal worker who delivered to my building began greeting me warmly, commenting on packages and weather as if we'd been neighbors for years instead of strangers who occasionally nodded in passing. My boss at the restaurant called after I'd missed 3 shifts without explanation. "Look, I get it if you need time off for the funeral and everything," he said, his voice carrying the particular strain of a manager dealing with unreliable employees. "But I need to know if you're coming back. The dinner rush has been brutal, and we're already short-staffed." "I quit," I told him, the words feeling strange in my mouth. I'd never quit a job without having another one lined up, had never walked away from steady income without a plan. There was a pause. "Quit? Like permanently?" "Yeah, permanently." Another pause. "Did you find something better? Because if it's about the schedule or the pay, maybe we can work something out. You're one of our most reliable servers." I almost laughed at that. Reliable. For years, I'd been reliable out of necessity, showing up for every shift because I needed every paycheck. Now I was reliable by choice, which somehow felt less virtuous. "I appreciate that," I told him, "but I'm making some life changes." The days blurred together in a haze of appointments and decisions I wasn't prepared to make. I met with professionals who used words like diversification and liquidity, who presented investment options with acronyms I didn't recognize. I looked at houses I couldn't imagine living in, sprawling estates with multiple bathrooms and kitchens I'd never use, guest rooms for visitors I didn't have, home offices for business I didn't conduct. The real estate agent, an enthusiastic woman named Mrs. Hamilton, drove me through neighborhoods I'd only seen from bus windows. She pointed out features like wine cellars and 3-car garages and swimming pools, amenities that felt abstract and unnecessary. "This one has excellent appreciation potential," she'd say, leading me through rooms that could fit my entire apartment. "The school district is top-rated, even though you don't have children yet. Always good to think ahead." I researched charities and investment opportunities and all the things rich people apparently did with their time and money. I read books about wealth management and philanthropy, trying to understand how to be responsible with resources I'd never expected to have. But mostly, I felt lost. 2 weeks after the will reading, Caleb called. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less confident than the brother who'd always known exactly what he wanted and how to get it. "We should get dinner," he said. "Somewhere nice. You can afford it now." The comment stung, even though I knew he didn't mean it cruelly. It was the same casual reference to my financial situation that everyone seemed to make now, as if my bank balance had become my primary identity. We met at an upscale steakhouse downtown, the kind of place Uncle Garrett used to take business associates when he wanted to impress them. The hostess seated us at a corner table with white linens and heavy silverware, everything polished and expensive. Caleb ordered wine that cost more than I used to make in a day, studying the menu with the same intensity he'd once applied to legal briefs. The server hovered attentively, refilling our water glasses and adjusting our napkins as if we were visiting dignitaries. "This is weird, isn't it?" Caleb said after we'd been served our appetizers, some kind of elaborate seafood arrangement that looked more like art than food. "Everything's weird," I agreed, cutting into something I couldn't identify, but was apparently worth $38. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me there was a mistake." Caleb ate mechanically, like he was going through the motions of enjoying an expensive meal but couldn't taste anything. "You know what the worst part is? I actually thought I was being selfless. I thought I was being the good nephew, the responsible one." "You were being responsible," I said. "Just maybe not for the right reasons." He put down his fork, abandoning the pretense of eating. "I need to tell you something. The last few years when you'd show up at Uncle Garrett's looking tired, wearing the same clothes, driving that piece of crap car, I was embarrassed. I thought you made the family look bad." That stung, but I wasn't surprised. Caleb had always been image conscious, even before Uncle Garrett became central to our lives. He'd been the kid who ironed his school clothes and organized his backpack the night before, who cared deeply about what teachers and classmates thought of our family. I thought if I could just be perfect enough, successful enough, devoted enough, then maybe the rest of the family could overlook your situation, he continued. Like I could balance out your failures with my achievements. I sipped the wine Caleb had chosen. Too dry for my taste, but probably expensive enough to impress the sommelier. That's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. It was. And it was unfair to you. He looked directly at me for the first time all evening, and I could see exhaustion in his eyes that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. I'm sorry. The apology hung between us, genuine but fragile. Neither of us knew how to navigate this new dynamic, how to be brothers when one of us had inherited millions and the other had inherited vintage wine and golf clubs. Over the next month, we fell into a routine of meeting weekly, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to walk around the park where we'd played as kids before our parents died and everything became complicated. The park had changed over the years, new playground equipment, updated landscaping, a memorial garden where the old baseball diamond used to be. But the basic geography remained the same, and walking those paths brought back memories of simpler times. Slowly, Caleb stopped looking at me like I'd stolen something from him. We talked about Uncle Garrett's last months, sharing memories I hadn't known we both carried. Caleb told me about the nights Uncle Garrett couldn't sleep and they'd sit up watching old movies, terrible action films from the 80s that Uncle Garrett found hilarious for reasons that escaped everyone else. How our uncle would tell stories about our grandmother, his sister, and how proud she'd been of both of us boys when we were small, before pride became complicated by expectations and disappointments. He kept a photo of us on his nightstand, Caleb said during one of our walks. The one from Christmas when you were maybe 8 and I was 12. You'd lost your front teeth and I had that awful bowl cut Mom insisted on giving us at home to save money. I remembered that photo vividly. We were both grinning despite our unfortunate hairstyles, arms around each other, completely unconscious of the future that would complicate our relationship with competition and financial anxiety and the weight of trying to impress adults who held our security in their hands. He'd look at it sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention, Caleb continued, especially toward the end, when the pain was bad and the medications made him confused. I think he was remembering when things were simpler. What would he say when he looked at it, I asked. Usually nothing. But once he told me we looked happy. Really happy, not performing happy. He said he missed that version of us. I realized Uncle Garrett had been watching both of us all along, seeing things we couldn't see about ourselves. He'd watched Caleb transform from a confident kid into someone performing constantly for approval. He'd watched me drift through jobs and relationships without much direction, but somehow maintain the ability to connect with people authentically. The observation felt both comforting and sad. Uncle Garrett had been collecting memories of who we used to be, holding on to a version of his nephews that existed before money and expectations and the complicated dynamics of adult family relationships. One evening, about 6 weeks after the will reading, I was in Uncle Garrett's house, my house now, though I still hadn't moved in permanently. The place felt enormous and echoey after my tiny apartment, all hardwood floors and high ceilings that amplified every sound. I was going through his personal effects, trying to decide what to keep and what to donate. The house was full of expensive things I didn't understand the value of, art I couldn't identify, books in languages I didn't recognize, furniture that looked important but uncomfortable. In his bedroom closet behind the expensive suits Caleb had helped him choose, I found a shoebox full of letters I'd written him over the years, which surprised me because I'd forgotten about most of them. Thank you notes for birthday checks, updates on my various jobs, postcards from the one vacation I'd taken to visit a friend in Colorado. The letters were all brief, conversational, unpolished, nothing like the formal correspondence Caleb probably wrote. I'd used cheap stationery, sometimes wrote in pencil when I couldn't find a pen, occasionally included doodles or small jokes. But Uncle Garrett had kept every single one, organizing them by date with rubber bands and handwritten labels. Under the letters was a journal bound in expensive leather, filled with Uncle Garrett's handwriting. The early entries were neat and controlled, but the later ones became shakier due to his illness. I almost didn't read it. It felt like violating his privacy even though he was gone. But curiosity won, and I opened to a random page from about 2 years earlier. Caleb came by today with another bottle of expensive wine. A 2015 Bordeaux that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. I appreciate the gesture, I suppose, but I miss the days when he'd just show up and we'd drink beer and watch baseball. Everything feels so carefully orchestrated now. Every gift selected to impress rather than please. It's exhausting to be constantly impressed by someone's thoughtfulness. I flipped to another entry, this one more recent. Found myself looking forward to unscheduled visits more than planned ones. When Caleb comes over, I feel like I'm being auditioned for something. The role of satisfied patriarch, perhaps, or grateful benefactor. When his brother stops by, I feel like I'm just spending time with family. The difference is subtle but significant. One feels like performance, the other feels like presence. Another entry, dated about 8 months before his death, tried to talk to Caleb about his brother today. Mentioned how much I enjoy our conversations, how refreshing it is to talk to someone who doesn't want anything from me. Caleb got defensive immediately, started listing all the ways his brother is irresponsible, all the opportunities he's wasted. I think he's afraid I'll judge him for his brother's struggles. He doesn't understand that I judge him more for his lack of compassion than I ever could for his brother's wandering. The observations were painfully accurate. Caleb had spent so much energy trying to distance himself from my failures that he'd lost the ability to see my humanity, just as I'd sometimes lost the ability to see his genuine care beneath all the performance. I kept reading, working backward through months of entries. Uncle Garrett had been documenting our visits, our conversations, his thoughts about our family dynamics. The picture that emerged was of a man who felt increasingly isolated by his wealth, grateful for authentic connection, but frustrated by the performances it inspired in people who wanted something from him. From 6 months before his death, sometimes I think about giving it all away before I die, just to see who would still visit me. But that seems cruel, and besides, I've already learned what I needed to know. Money doesn't create love, but it certainly reveals the absence of it. From 3 months before he passed, made my final decision about the will today. I know it will hurt Caleb initially, but I hope someday he understands. His brother has something rare, the ability to love people without agenda. Caleb has lost that somewhere along the way, buried under layers of ambition and anxiety about appearances. Maybe this will help him find it again. They need each other more than either of them realizes. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Uncle Garrett died. I won't be here much longer, and I find myself surprisingly at peace with that. My greatest regret is not being a better uncle to these boys when they were younger, when they needed guidance more than money. But perhaps it's not too late for them to learn what I'm trying to teach them now. Love isn't something you earn through perfect behavior. It's something you give freely, without expectation of return. I hope they remember that long after they've spent whatever I leave them. I closed the journal, feeling like I'd been entrusted with something precious and painful. Uncle Garrett had been more aware of our family dynamics than either of us realized, watching us struggle with patterns that went back generations. 3 months after the will reading, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I called Caleb and asked him to meet me at the lawyer's office. I want to split it, I told him when we sat down with Miss Patterson, the same lawyer who'd read the will initially. Caleb's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked like the confused 12-year-old who'd watched our parents die in that car accident. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, but Uncle Garrett was right about authenticity, and this feels authentic to me. You did love him, even if your way of showing it got twisted up with other stuff, and you're my brother. We're supposed to take care of each other. Miss Patterson explained the legal complexities involved in restructuring the inheritance. Taxes would be involved, paperwork would need to be filed, assets would need to be revalued and redistributed. The process would take months and cost thousands in legal fees. Are you certain about this decision? She asked, clearly surprised by my request. Inheritance disputes usually go in the other direction, with people fighting for more rather than giving away what they've received. I'm certain, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what certainty meant anymore. The legal work was complicated and tedious. We had to establish new trusts, transfer property titles, recalculate tax obligations. Caleb got the house and half the financial assets, still enough to ensure he'd never have to worry about money again. I kept the commercial properties and the remainder of the portfolio, along with the responsibility of managing rental income and tenant relationships. Are you sure about this? Caleb asked as we signed the final papers months later. I'm sure, I said, but I have one condition. He tensed, probably expecting me to demand some form of ongoing control or recognition for my generosity. What? We both go to therapy. Separately at first, maybe together eventually. We've got a lot of family stuff to work through, and now we can afford the good therapists. Caleb laughed. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from him in years, free of the calculated charm he'd perfected for Uncle Garrett and professional contacts. Deal. The transition wasn't smooth or immediate. Money changes things in ways you don't expect, even when you're trying to be conscious about it. Friends treated me differently when they found out about the inheritance, though the reactions varied wildly. Some became distant, assuming I'd become pretentious or forgetting what normal life was like. They'd decline invitations to dinner, claiming they couldn't afford restaurants, I suggested, even when I offered to pay. They seemed to assume that wealth would automatically make me judgmental about their financial situations. Others became overly interested in maintaining our friendship, always suggesting expensive activities I should pay for, dropping hints about their own financial struggles or investment opportunities. They'd mention needing new cars or planning vacations they couldn't quite afford, speaking with the particular hopefulness of people who think they're being subtle. My therapist, Dr. Chen, helped me navigate the guilt and anxiety that came with sudden wealth. She specialized in what she called life transition counseling, though she admitted that inheriting millions was outside her usual range of experience. You didn't do anything wrong by inheriting this money, she reminded me during one session, speaking with the patient repetition of someone who'd made this point multiple times. Your uncle chose to give it to you based on who you are as a person. That's not an accident or a mistake. It's recognition. But why me? I asked for what must have been the dozenth time. Caleb worked so much harder for it. He sacrificed more, invested more time and energy. Hard work isn't the only thing that matters, she said, adjusting her glasses in the way that meant she was about to make an important point. Sometimes kindness matters more. Sometimes authenticity matters more. Your uncle valued those qualities over effort or ambition. But that seems unfair to Caleb. Life isn't fair, she said simply. but that doesn't mean it's meaningless. Your uncle saw something in your relationship with him that he valued more than devotion or service. He saw genuine care without ulterior motive. Dr. Chen helped me understand that survivor's guilt was common in inheritance situations, especially when the distribution seemed unequal or unexpected. She also helped me recognize that my impulse to share the inheritance with Caleb came from genuine love rather than guilt or social pressure. You're not giving him money because you feel sorry for him, she observed. You're giving him money because you want to have a relationship with him that isn't defined by financial inequality. Caleb was having his own therapeutic journey with Dr. Martinez, a specialist in anxiety and perfectionism. The work was apparently painful. 15 years of performing for approval had created deep patterns that required careful examination and gradual modification. He told me about some of his sessions during our weekly coffee meetings, which had become a regular ritual neither of us wanted to abandon. She asked me to describe a time when I felt genuinely happy, not accomplished or successful, just happy, he said one afternoon. I couldn't think of anything recent. The last thing I could remember was Christmas morning when we were kids, before Mom and Dad died. That was a good Christmas, I agreed. You got that microscope you'd wanted, and I got the art supplies. We spent the whole day setting up experiments and drawing pictures, he continued. Mom made her terrible fudge that was always too sweet, and Dad kept falling asleep during the movies we wanted to watch. It was the kind of happiness that didn't require audience or validation, just presence and simple pleasures. We'd been content to entertain ourselves, to enjoy each other's company without competing for attention or approval. Dr. Martinez says I learned early that love was conditional, Caleb said, that I had to earn it through achievement and good behavior. When Mom and Dad died, I transferred that pattern to every other relationship, including with Uncle Garrett. That made sense. Our parents had died when Caleb was 17 and I was 14. Old enough to understand loss, but young enough to internalize it as abandonment. We'd both developed different coping mechanisms. I'd become independent to avoid disappointment. Caleb had become perfect to avoid rejection. A year after the will reading, Caleb made his own major life change. He left his corporate law firm and started a nonprofit clinic specializing in elder care issues. The decision surprised everyone who knew him, including me. Why elder care? I asked when he first mentioned the idea. Because I understand the system now, he said, his voice carrying a conviction I hadn't heard since we were teenagers. I know how overwhelming it is to navigate insurance companies, how to evaluate care facilities, how to have impossible conversations about end-of-life decisions. But more than that, I understand what it does to families. His first client was a woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, no relation to my financial advisor, whose father had dementia and whose siblings were fighting over who should make medical decisions. The family was fracturing under the stress of caregiving, each sibling convinced they knew what was best, none of them communicating effectively. I watched you with Uncle Garrett, she told Caleb during their initial consultation. You understood the guilt and the exhaustion and the impossible choices. I need someone who's been through it. Caleb's practice grew quickly, but not in the way he'd expected. Word spread through support groups and hospital social workers, rather than through traditional legal networking. His clients weren't wealthy families protecting assets. They were middle-class people struggling with systems that seemed designed to confuse and exploit them during vulnerable times. He discovered that his years of managing Uncle Garrett's care had given him expertise that law school couldn't provide. He knew which nursing homes had the best staff-to-patient ratios, which insurance companies would fight coverage claims most aggressively, which specialists actually listened to families rather than just processing patients. More importantly, he understood the emotional complexity of caring for aging relatives, the guilt of wanting your own life back, the frustration of watching someone you love disappear gradually, the impossible balance between respect for autonomy and need for safety. One case particularly affected him. An elderly man named Mr. Thompson was being pressured by his adult children to sell his house and move to assisted living. The children were well-meaning but insistent, convinced that their father was too frail to live independently. Mr. Thompson didn't want to leave the house he'd shared with his deceased wife for 40 years. Every room held memories. The garden contained plants they'd chosen together. The neighbors were old friends who checked on him regularly. Caleb spent weeks mediating between the family members, helping them understand each other's perspectives. The children were terrified their father would fall or forget to turn off the stove. The father was terrified of losing his independence and connection to his past. The solution they worked out wasn't perfect, but it was human. Mr. Thompson stayed in his house with twice-weekly home health visits and a medical alert system. His children took turns checking in daily, and neighbors agreed to be more formally involved in his care network. 6 months later, Mr. Thompson was still living independently, and his relationship with his children had actually improved because they'd stopped fighting about his living situation. I think Uncle Garrett would have approved, Caleb told me after resolving the case. It wasn't about finding the legally optimal solution. It was about finding the solution that honored everyone's humanity. Meanwhile, I was struggling with my own transition. I'd enrolled in a master's program in social work, finally having the financial freedom to pursue education that mattered to me, rather than just whatever would lead to immediate employment. The decision surprised everyone, including myself. My undergraduate degree was in general studies, basically a collection of courses I'd completed part-time while working multiple jobs without any clear career direction. Social work seemed like an extension of qualities I'd always had, but never thought to professionalize. My professors were younger than me, my classmates fresh out of undergraduate programs. I felt ancient and behind, carrying life experience they lacked, but missing theoretical frameworks they'd mastered. I was the student who asked practical questions about policy implementation while they debated abstract concepts about social justice. But I was also more focused than I'd ever been in an educational setting. I knew why I was there. For my fieldwork placement, I chose a community center in the neighborhood where I'd grown up, the same area where Uncle Garrett had lived, though in a very different socioeconomic section. I worked with families facing eviction, teenagers aging out of foster care, elderly people who couldn't afford their medications. The work was heartbreaking and rewarding in equal measure. Every day brought stories of people navigating systems designed by bureaucrats who'd never experienced poverty, trying to access services that required documentation they didn't have, fighting for basic dignity in situations that stripped it away systematically. Mrs. Washington was typical of my clients, a 67-year-old woman whose landlord was trying to evict her so he could renovate and raise the rent. She'd lived in her apartment for 30 years, raised her grandchildren there after her daughter died in a car accident, built a community of neighbors who looked out for each other. The legal notices were written in language designed to confuse rather than inform. The court system was located across town, accessible only by buses that ran infrequently. The free legal aid clinic had a 6-month waiting list for non-emergency cases. I got nowhere with legal aid, she told me during one of our meetings. They're too busy, and I don't know how to fight this myself. I'm not educated like you are. Mrs. Washington had raised 4 children as a single mother while working night shifts at a factory. She'd supported grandchildren through high school and college, volunteering at their schools and organizing community events. She was intelligent and resourceful, but the system was designed to make her feel stupid and helpless. I connected her with Caleb's clinic. My brother took the case pro bono, and within 6 months, they'd not only stopped the eviction, but documented enough housing violations to force the landlord to make significant improvements throughout the building. More importantly, Caleb helped Mrs. Washington understand her rights as a tenant, connected her with other residents facing similar pressure, and supported their efforts to organize for better living conditions. It felt good, working together like that, like we were finally using our resources for something Uncle Garrett would have supported, rather than just accumulating wealth for its own sake. But the work also highlighted the vast inequality that our inheritance represented. I was spending my days with people who chose between paying rent and buying prescription medications, while I owned commercial properties that generated more in monthly rent than most of my clients earned in a year. The cognitive dissonance was sometimes overwhelming. I'd leave the community center after listening to someone describe losing their housing or going without food, then drive home to a house worth more than most people would earn in multiple lifetimes. Dr. Chen helped me process these feelings during our weekly sessions, which had evolved from crisis management to ongoing personal development. Guilt doesn't serve anyone if it just makes you feel bad without motivating action, she observed. The question isn't whether you deserve to have more than other people. The question is what you're doing with the privilege you've been given. But how do I know if I'm doing enough? I asked. How do I know if I'm making a real difference or just making myself feel better about being wealthy? That's the wrong question, she said. The right question is whether you're using your resources in alignment with your values, whether you're contributing to solutions rather than just lamenting problems. I started thinking more systematically about philanthropy, moving beyond individual cases to consider structural change. Uncle Garrett had been generous with individual charities, but hadn't been particularly strategic about addressing root causes of the problems he donated to address. 2 years after the will reading, I established a foundation focused on affordable housing and elder care advocacy. Not the kind of foundation that hosts fancy galas and gives out symbolic checks for photo opportunities, but one that funded direct services, policy research, and community organizing. The first major grant went to legal aid organizations like Caleb's Clinic, expanding their capacity to serve low-income families facing housing instability. The second funded a program that trained community health workers to support elderly people who wanted to age in their own homes rather than in institutional settings. We also started a scholarship program for first-generation college students studying social work, nursing, or law with a commitment to serving low-income communities. I remembered how Uncle Garrett's small birthday checks had helped me through lean months, how even modest financial support could make education possible for people without family wealth. The scholarship recipients had to write essays about their career goals and community connections. Reading their applications reminded me why I'd gone into social work. Not because I was particularly talented or virtuous, but because I'd experienced enough financial insecurity to understand how arbitrary the line between stability and crisis could be. One recipient was a young woman named Destiny, whose mother cleaned office buildings at night while attending community college during the day. Destiny had been caring for her younger sibling since she was 12, helping with homework and managing household responsibilities while maintaining honor roll grades. In her essay, she wrote, "I want to become a social worker because I understand what it feels like to need help, but not know how to ask for it. I want to be the person who makes systems work for families instead of against them." She reminded me of myself at that age, though she was far more articulate about her goals than I'd been. The scholarship covered her tuition and living expenses for 4 years, allowing her to focus on studies rather than splitting attention between school and work. 3 years after Uncle Garrett's death, Caleb got married. Her name was Dr. Lisa Chen, coincidentally sharing a surname with my therapist, though they weren't related. Lisa was an oncologist at the hospital where Uncle Garrett had received treatment, and they'd met during one of his chemo sessions. The relationship developed slowly. Lisa had seen too many families destroyed by medical crises to rush into anything serious with someone she'd met in that context. But she appreciated Caleb's genuine care for Uncle Garrett, his willingness to ask difficult questions about treatment options, his ability to advocate effectively without being aggressive. She understood grief in ways that most people didn't. She'd held the hands of dying patients, supported families through impossible decisions, witnessed the full spectrum of how people respond to terminal illness. She saw through Caleb's performance to the genuine love and fear underneath. More importantly, she liked him for who he was rather than who he thought he should be. When Caleb tried to impress her with expensive restaurants or elaborate gestures, she seemed more interested in quiet conversations about books they'd both read or walks through parks where they could talk without distractions. I was Caleb's best man. In my speech, I talked about second chances and authentic love, and how Uncle Garrett would have approved of Lisa's ability to make Caleb laugh during his terrible karaoke attempts at the rehearsal dinner. Watching them together reminded me of what I'd seen in Uncle Garrett's journal entries, the difference between performance and presence. Caleb wasn't trying to earn Lisa's love through perfect behavior. He was just enjoying her company and letting her enjoy his. After the ceremony, Lisa pulled me aside during the reception. "Thank you for whatever you did to help him find himself again," she said, her voice barely audible over the band. "The man I married is so much happier than the man I first met." "I didn't do anything," I protested. "He did the work himself." "Maybe," she said, "but sometimes people need permission to change. Or maybe they need to see that they're loved for who they are, not who they think they should be." At the reception, I watched Caleb dancing with his new wife, laughing at something she'd whispered in his ear. He looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. No performance, no careful calculation of how others might perceive his behavior. Just joy. The wedding also marked a milestone in our relationship as brothers. We'd moved past the inheritance drama into something that felt more like genuine friendship. We still had Sunday dinners regularly, though now they often included Lisa and whatever graduate school friends I could convince to join us. We'd cook together, argue about politics in the comfortable way that siblings can, play board games that got competitive but never mean. Sometimes we talked about Uncle Garrett, but more often we didn't need to. His presence was felt in the work we'd chosen, the relationships we'd built, the way we'd learned to care for each other without keeping score. 4 years after the will reading, I finished my master's degree in social work. My thesis examined the psychological impacts of intergenerational wealth transfer on family relationships, drawing heavily on my own experience and the cases I'd encountered through the foundation. My advisor, Dr. Martinez, not Caleb's therapist, but another Dr. Martinez, joked that I was the only student writing from personal experience rather than research. The combination of lived experience and theoretical framework created something unique, she said. Though she couldn't predict whether academic journals would find it compelling, the thesis defense went better than expected. The committee was particularly interested in my analysis of how inherited wealth affected family dynamics across different socioeconomic backgrounds. Wealthy families, I argued, often developed elaborate systems for managing money across generations, but paid less attention to the emotional inheritance that accompanied financial assets. Poor and middle-class families, conversely, often had more honest conversations about money, perhaps because scarcity forced transparency, but lacked resources to support individual family members through major life transitions. Uncle Garrett's inheritance had disrupted both patterns. We'd received wealth without the generational training that usually accompanied it, forcing us to develop new frameworks for understanding our relationships to each other and to money itself. After graduation, I was offered a position directing the foundation full-time. The board, which included Caleb, Lisa, and several community leaders I'd worked with over the years, thought my combination of direct service experience and resource management made me uniquely qualified. The work was different from frontline social work, but equally meaningful. Instead of serving individual clients, I was working to change systems that affected thousands of people. Instead of crisis intervention, I was focusing on prevention and long-term change. Caleb's clinic had become a model for other communities facing similar elder care challenges. By our 4th year, he'd helped establish similar programs in 6 other cities, training attorneys and social workers to replicate his approach. The work was demanding but sustainable, funded partly through fees from clients who could afford to pay, and partly through grants from foundations like mine. One case from his 2nd year still stands out to me. An elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, sharing a surname with the lawyer who'd read Uncle Garrett's will, had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. Her adult son wanted to immediately take over all her financial and medical decisions, convinced that any cognitive impairment made her incompetent. Mrs. Patterson was still capable of managing most aspects of her life independently. She could cook, clean, drive safely during daylight hours, and maintain her friendships. but she'd started forgetting appointments occasionally and sometimes repeated stories without realizing it. Her son was terrified that she'd be taken advantage of or hurt herself through forgetfulness. His intentions were good, but his approach was infantilizing and premature. He wanted to move her to a memory care facility immediately, sell her house, and assume control of her finances. Caleb worked with the family for months, helping them understand the difference between support and control. They developed a graduated plan that provided Mrs. Patterson with increasing assistance as her condition progressed, while preserving her autonomy as much as possible. The son learned to distinguish between reasonable accommodations, like organizing her medications in weekly pill containers, and unnecessary restrictions like forbidding her from driving or managing her own bank account. Mrs. Patterson learned to accept help without feeling like she was losing her identity. 2 years later, Mrs. Patterson was still living in her own home with daily check-ins from home health aides and weekly visits from her son. Her dementia had progressed, but slowly, and she'd maintained her sense of dignity and independence far longer than would have been possible in institutional care. The case reminded me of Uncle Garrett's situation, though in reverse. Uncle Garrett had needed more care than he'd been willing to accept, while Mrs. Patterson needed less control than her family wanted to impose. Both situations required careful negotiation between safety and autonomy, between love and overprotection. By our 5th year post-inheritance, the foundation had distributed over $2 million in grants to organizations working on housing stability, elder care advocacy, and educational access. The impact was measurable. Families housed, legal cases won, students graduated, but also broader than what could be quantified. The legal aid clinic we'd funded had developed new models for serving low-income seniors that were being replicated nationally. The community health worker program had demonstrated cost-effective alternatives to nursing home placement that were influencing state policy discussions. The scholarship program had graduated its first cohort of students, young people who were now working in their communities as social workers, nurses, and attorneys. Many stayed in touch, sending updates about their work and thanking the foundation for opportunities that had changed their life trajectories. But the most significant change was in how Caleb and I related to each other and to our family history. We'd broken patterns that had been developing for generations, learning to see wealth as responsibility rather than trophy, relationship as presence rather than performance. Sometimes I still visited Uncle Garrett's grave, though less frequently than in the first year after his death. The conversations were different now, updates rather than questions, reports rather than appeals for guidance. I told him about Mrs. Rodriguez finding permanent housing after 18 months of displacement, about Destiny graduating summa cum laude and accepting a job with a family services agency in her hometown, about Caleb's clinic preventing 17 families from losing their homes to predatory lending practices. I told him about Lisa's pregnancy, announced at a Sunday dinner that had everyone crying with joy, about plans for a nursery and discussions of work-life balance, and Caleb's evolution from someone who'd measured success through external achievement to someone who was learning to find meaning in daily acts of care. Last month, I brought news about the affordable housing development we'd helped fund. 36 units for seniors and families transitioning out of homelessness, designed with input from future residents rather than imposed by architects who'd never experienced housing insecurity. Mrs. Washington would be one of the first residents when the building opened next spring. At 71, she'd become an advocate for tenant rights throughout the city, teaching other elderly residents how to organize and demand better living conditions. The units weren't luxurious, but they were dignified. Private bathrooms, small kitchens, space for personal belongings accumulated over lifetimes. Most importantly, they were affordable and permanent, allowing residents to build community, rather than moving constantly in response to gentrification or rent increases. I think Uncle Garrett would be proud of how we've used his gifts, not just the money, but the lessons about authentic relationship and genuine care. The inheritance changed our lives, but not in the ways we'd expected when we sat in that lawyer's office 5 years ago. It didn't make us happier automatically, but it gave us the freedom to discover what might make us happy. For Caleb, that meant meaningful work and authentic relationships built on mutual respect rather than mutual benefit. For me, it meant connection and service and the opportunity to help others navigate systems that had once overwhelmed me. The money was Uncle Garrett's gift to us, but the real inheritance was more complex. It was permission to be ourselves rather than performances of who we thought we should be. It was recognition that love doesn't have to be earned through perfect behavior or impressive achievements. It was the understanding that authentic care looks different from elaborate gestures. Most importantly, it was the knowledge that we were capable of taking care of each other and our community in ways that honored both our individual strengths and our shared responsibilities. 5 years later, I'm working full-time with the foundation while finishing a PhD in social policy. My dissertation examines how inherited wealth can be structured to support community development rather than just individual enrichment. The research draws on case studies from around the country, but the motivation comes from Uncle Garrett's example. Caleb's clinic has expanded into a statewide network of programs serving rural and urban communities. He's testified before legislative committees about needed reforms to elder care policy and co-authored articles in legal journals about family-centered approaches to guardianship law. More importantly, he's become the kind of person he wanted to be when we were children, before adult anxieties about success and approval complicated his natural compassion. We still have Sunday dinners, though now they include Lisa and their 6-month-old daughter, Rebecca. Named after our mother, she has Caleb's serious eyes and Lisa's quick smile. Watching Caleb with his daughter reminds me of the brother I grew up with, gentle and protective but not controlling. Rebecca will grow up wealthy, but hopefully she'll also grow up understanding that wealth comes with obligations. That privilege is most meaningful when it's shared, that the point of having resources isn't accumulation but contribution. The money allowed us to become more ourselves rather than less. Uncle Garrett knew that when he structured his will the way he did, he understood that Caleb needed permission to stop performing, and I needed permission to matter. Neither of us had to earn what he gave us, which was precisely the point. Love, real love, isn't transactional. It doesn't require perfect behavior or impressive achievements. It just requires recognition of shared humanity and willingness to care for each other across difference. That's what Uncle Garrett taught us, and that's what we're trying to teach Rebecca. Not through lectures or formal lessons, but through the choices we make every day about how to use what we've been given. The inheritance was never really about money. It was about becoming the people we were capable of being when fear and competition and performative love weren't driving our decisions. It was about learning to see each other clearly and care for each other well. In the end, that's worth more than any amount of money in any bank account. That's the real treasure Uncle Garrett left us, even if it took us years to understand how to find it.